Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Like Ron said, my name's Phil. I'm from the Kansas City Woodturners. Although I was here, it was either last year or the year before, I don't remember when. It was last year, and did a demo for you guys on turning enclosed forms. But tonight we're going to talk about greenwood. So a few people were confused. They thought I was going to bring in some wood painted green or green in color. We're not talking about greenwood, we're talking about greenwood.
Oh, that greenwood.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I don't live too far from there.
Oh, yeah? But how many people turn greenwood regularly? Raise your hand. A few people? Well, all right, how many people turn greenwood on occasion? There we go. How many people have never turned greenwood? How many people think it is the color of the wood I'm talking about still? All right. So when we're talking about greenwood, we're talking about wood that is actually has moisture in it that is not yet dry. And so I don't know where it came to be called greenwood, but that's what they call it. So on the sheet here, these are kind of some of my things that I think about when I'm working with greenwood. These are not all the thoughts people have on greenwood, because there are books devoted to that topic, and I listed a few on here actually, from some smarter people than me that have talked about turning greenwood. But I want to start with a little science lesson. So this is the part where everybody takes a nap, and then we'll turn some wood, and we'll kind of go from there. But the reason why I want to start with a little science lesson is because in my experience, and kind of the interesting thing that I've gotten out of turning greenwood is that you are able to control or attempt to control the wood through drying and through loss of moisture to create the shape that you want, the final shape that you want. So Mel, you actually have a really great examples of turning, thin green wood right there and then seeing kind of what it does. You said it took like a day or two to dry. We'll talk about that, but that's kind of a very interesting process, that if you turn the wood thin enough, it'll go from being sopping wet one day to being completely dry in just a couple of days, and reach its equilibrium point pretty quickly. So when we talk about greenwood, the reason why I like to turn greenwood too is because it's free and you can get it just about anywhere. Even here in Kansas, which is pretty flat, there are trees in Kansas, and there is a ton of trees here in the Kansas City area, and they're coming down all the time, especially with the droughts we've had the past couple of years, or the massive rainfalls, or the storms and whatnot. I can just wake up in the morning and I open up my door and I can just hear a chainsaw a couple miles away, and I'll be like, all right, maybe I should check that out. I've had to clear out all my wood because my wife got mad at me. So she didn't get too mad, but she was, telling me that I should clear out my pile of wood. So the big thing to kind of know about greenwood when you're starting out is that greenwood has a lot of moisture in it, and there's kind of two main types of moisture. There's free moisture, and then there's bound moisture. So free moisture, when you think about a piece of wood, a tree, a tree goes up and down. Think about it as a giant stack of straws. So as the tree is growing, water is being pulled up through all those straws. The tree is growing larger, more straws are being added to it. And so there's these empty straw tubes that are going up that are filled with water. The walls of the straws are also filled with water, and we call that bound moisture. So your free moisture is the water that's in the straw, and then in the middle of the straw. And then your bound moisture is the wood that's actually in the cell walls of the straw. So we're talking about trees, we're talking about the free moisture is what evaporates off of the tree first, because it is easy to relieve itself out of those straws. But that bound moisture is what hangs around a lot longer and takes a lot longer to evaporate, because it has to move out of the cell wall into that open avenue and then evaporate out. So who did I lose on that? Right there. Bound moisture and free moisture. All right? You don't really need to know the names of them, but it's just handy to know that there is this kind of phenomenon going on in wood. And this only happens after you cut the tree down. While the tree is alive, generally it's pulling moisture through it all the time, so it can grow and get larger. Different parts of the tree will have different amounts of moisture during its lifetime. The pith of the tree, while it's growing, while it's still alive, will generally have less moisture than the exterior of the tree, where the or on the bark or on the cadmium layers of the tree, that's where a lot of moisture is being pulled up, and that's where most of the moisture is in a tree there. So when you cut a tree down or you cut a branch down, you'll actually find that there's more moisture on the outside by the bark than there is on the very inside of that piece of wood. And the important part of knowing that, or about knowing that that is there, is that once it starts to dry, once that free moisture that's easily able to evaporate off the outside of that tree starts to evaporate off, the tree is going to start to shrink, or it starts to change shape. And as it does that, if it doesn't have anywhere to move or go, it's going to start to crack. How many of you have ever turned a green piece of wood and had it crack on you? Excellent. How many of you have rough turned bowls and thinking, oh great, in a couple of months I'm going to have these nice pieces of wood to crack or to work with, and then you look at them and all of them have cracks all over them. Anybody? All right. The reason why there's all these cracks is because as the moisture is being lost all over the pieces of wood, it's being lost at different times. Some of the wood is losing water very quickly, some of it's not losing it very fast at all, and those differences create the tensions in the wood that force it to pull apart. So there are kind of three main shrinkage or ways that a log or a piece of wood will shrink. Two of them are important, one is not very important. The longitudinal shrinkage, and that's if you're thinking about the longitudinal shrinkage occurs along the vertical of your tree. It's very little, it's about, I think it's 0.01 or 0.1% shrinkage rate. So this doesn't shrink down very much, there we go, shrink down very much at all, right? But where it does shrink is going to be, whoop. I'll try to hold it in the video there. There we go. It's going to be around its circumference, okay? And then also across its radial shrinkage, okay? So my diagrams here, hopefully they kind of help explain on the sheet here. Your circumferential, there's your science word for the day, is going to be the circumference of the tree is going to shrink around itself. It's going to actually shrink smaller, right? And then your radial shrinkage is how if we look at this piece of wood right here, you can see that it's not, am I on this one over here? It's not flat anymore. When I cut this on a bandsaw and it was perfectly flat. But from the middle here, it actually shrinks in on itself on both sides there, so that this outside edge is kind of pulling itself together while your center is kind of staying, isn't shrinking as much. So your outside here is going to shrink more than your inside. So I cut this with two straight lines, and as you can see, I don't have two straight cuts anymore. That's how much change we're looking at when we're talking about shrinkage. The radial shrinkage will be about 4%, and then your circumferential shrinkage will be about 8%. So
Be a test on this.
there is not going to be a test. There's not going to be a test. So if this sounds interesting to you, there are books that you can read on this, and the main thing I want you to take from it is to know that your wood moves, and you can control how your wood moves to create the forms and shapes that you want to. And also how you can save that big beautiful log that's out in your yard that you don't have enough time to get to right now, but you might have in a few weeks, from cracking up into a billion pieces and turning into firewood. Usually, if you have a nice long log, I say keep it all in one piece. But if you have short logs, I recommend you cut them up pretty quickly so that you can allow for this shrinkage to occur around your wood right here. And right here, the pith is kind of running right here through the middle. You can see that's kind of where that biggest gap is right there. And that's where you're going to get all these cracks that happen around the edge. I'm going to pass these around. You can see there actually are not any cracks around the edge of these pieces of wood because I've made those cuts. Now some trees, it'll vary how that'll work. Oak will pretty much crack on you any way, shape, or form that it will want to, because oak has very large pores. It has very large straws, if you will. So even though it might start with a lot of moisture, its free moisture evaporates very quickly, and its bound moisture evaporates very slowly, and it doesn't give it that time to have that elastic movement that some other woods will. So something that's very stable, like, what's a stable wood? No wood is stable. Some woods that are generally a tighter grain will generally be a little more stable in their drying, a little more equal in their loss of free moisture and bound moisture. Once you've lost enough of your free moisture and bound moisture, you'll eventually get to what we call EMC, or equilibrium moisture content. And that is basically the moisture in the air. Right now, here in Kansas City, this kind of a humid day, is probably around 15 to 12%. 12 to 15%, there we go. During winter, that drops a little bit down, more like 10 to 12%. How do I know this? If you take a moisture meter and you check your wood during different times of the year, and I have slices of wood from different trees that I've cut down that I'll check periodically, I'll see that moisture go up and down in those pieces of wood. I didn't bring mine tonight, but someone did. What was his name? Stan. Stan brought his moisture meter right here. I don't really use a moisture meter when I'm wood turning, but this is super handy too with flat work, or even with checking the moisture on rough out bowls. You can see kind of number-wise what that moisture looks like. And when you have when the tree is full of moisture, it's going to be 32% or above. And once it gets below that, to that bound moisture, that's where we start to see 20%, 15%, 12%. If you put it in a kiln and dry it out, it'll get down to that 8% range right there. So these are super handy if you are really particular about the number. I don't really worry about the number because I worry about the weight. And once this becomes a constant weight, I know that this has reached equilibrium with the outside air around me and is no longer going to lose any aggressive moisture. It might lose a little bit. It might also gain a little bit more throughout the year. Now this I actually turned last night from some of the maple that I'm going to turn here tonight for you. I turned it, I sanded it, I buffed it, and then I sprayed it down with a solution that I'll talk about later. So you can actually feel like the grain got a little bit raised on me here. But feel it and see if you can tell if there's any moisture on it or not. So pass that around. So this tree was cut down about a month and a half, 2 months ago. It sat in my yard. This was a shorter log. It was probably about 30 or so inches. And I had to lose a number of inches on either side. So I think I probably had about 16 or so inches to really work with. So I got 2 big pieces out of it that I'm going to turn into larger bowls, and then I got these pieces out of it, and a few other pieces out of it too. But when I cut it with my chainsaw, I immediately put it into a barrel of water. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. That's a whole other topic. But I wanted to try and keep as much moisture in those pieces before I got to using them so that I could get the maximum amount of movement out of the pieces when I'm done. So this piece, last night I finished it. I weighed it. I wrote that number in grams on this bag right here. It says 109 grams. This morning when I weighed it, it said 103 grams. I got to write that down now. But I'll weigh this piece every couple of days or so and just see when it stops losing moisture. And then I know that it no longer has excessive moisture to lose. I'll put it in this paper bag here to slow the drying so that it doesn't dry too quickly. So with something like oak that dries quickly, you need to slow or retard the drying process so that it doesn't dry too quickly and then crack. By putting it in a paper bag like this or a bag with shavings in it, you're going to slow down that drying and make a microclimate. There we go. A microclimate of inside the bag there will be one moisture, outside the bag there will be another moisture. Paper is permeable, so it will slowly leach out that moisture as it's drying, but it won't let it all out right away. If that had been oak and I pulled it out of this bag, you'd be able to hear it crackle as it just starts to pull itself together. But with maple like that, maple's a lot more forgiving, and it'll dry nicely in a paper bag, and I'll take it out every day or so to make sure that the bag lets some of that moisture out. I don't want to put it in a plastic bag because that will contain all the moisture. I actually want it to release the moisture. I just want to do it slower. So you said, Mel, you put yours on the table with an air conditioner next to it. What type of wood was it?
Sycamore.
Sycamore? So sycamore is pretty forgiving. If that had been oak, it probably would have cracked. So different woods will react differently, and as you work with them more, you'll kind of figure out what woods kind of dry better, or you have a method for drying better than other woods, and things like that. Okay, that's kind of the boring sciencey stuff. Any questions about that, though? I know I just talked a lot and said a lot of words. But anybody have questions about that? Or if you have questions throughout the demo, please let me know. Because I'm not going to answer everybody's questions here during my demo, but hopefully if you have specific questions about working with green wood, we can talk about that. All right.
What do you put in the paper bag with it? Just a paper bag?
In this case, I just put it in a paper bag. And usually with pieces like this, that's what I'll do. If it's something like oak, I might double back it just to slow it down for a couple of days there. But just a paper bag. If you put shavings in with it, you're adding a lot more moisture to it, which is fine depending on your process. If it's a thicker piece, you might want to do that. But with how thin this piece is, or how thin the pieces that melded over there are, you don't need additional retainers in there to hold in more moisture. The paper bag should be fine. This is an Aldi bag. I actually prefer the Trader Joe's bags. They're a little bit more robust. You can get paper bags anywhere though. And I like these big grocery bags. You can kind of close them up and wrap them up. And I just write the numbers on the outside when I weigh them. I use a little kitchen scale, or postage stamp scale might work for smaller things too. So if you've got a kitchen scale at home, set it to grams, not to ounces, because grams are a lot easier to actually see the percentages. So this is 109 grams yesterday. It's 103 today. Probably tomorrow it'll be under 100. And then at some point it'll probably reach maybe around 70, 75, 80 grams or so. It'll just start to stick around that same number, and it's not going to lose any more weight. And then I know that it's dry, and I can actually go and properly finish it with an oil, lacquer, whatever you want to use on it. If you try to finish it prior to that, you're just locking the moisture in. And actually, David Ellsworth used to do that. He used to actually coat his green turned pieces with flaxseed oil, not flaxseed. What's that?
Linseed oil?
Linseed oil, to slow down the drying process. And then he would start to put more coats on, and eventually he would buff them off. But he would allow them to sit there and, and dry for months. And he's turning things that, if you've ever seen one of David's pieces, they're very thin. So he needed to slow them down so they didn't speed apart on him there too. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
On this one that you passed around, I noticed that the mounting side is depressed in the middle. Did you actually turn it that way, or did that shrink?
That's a great question. I turned it that way. So I reversed it on my lathe here, and then I put a little recess, not a recess, but put a little dome on the back there, because as it dries, that bottom is going to change shape. And will probably, when I put it on a level surface, it's not going to sit properly. So what I'll eventually do to finish that is actually put a flat piece of sandpaper on the flat surface, and I'll gently stroke the bottom there to make it flat, and then I'll buff it out using either like a white wheel, or I'll show you a pad that I use to buff things out too, just to buff that, that raised grain off. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? All right. Turning green wood is very similar to turning dry wood, but it's more fun because it's not as hard, it's softer, the shavings tend to come off a lot more aggressively, and you get wet sometimes. So there's two ways to kind of work with green wood. I'm going to just briefly talk about one, which is the twice turn method, where you rough out a bowl into a bowl shape, and you leave it thick so it can dry for a year or so, and then you can put it back on the lathe, return it again a second time, and it will be perfectly round at that point because it'll be fully dry. Then the next thing that we'll do real quick is spend time looking at a once turn bowl, and we are intentionally going to turn it so that it changes shape. So first things first, with wet wood you can use a screw chuck, you can use a face plate, you can start it between centers, just about any way you feel comfortable. Because it is wet, the wood fibers are softer. It is always a good idea to make sure that it is secure and use your tailstock. Does this have a... Yes, it does.
Yeah.
There we go. Make sure that it's on there nice and tight. Now somebody said, oh, it's not green wood, it doesn't have bark on it. And that's true. I didn't bring anything with bark on. I didn't want to hurt anybody. But Usually, if your tree's small enough or if your lathe is big enough, you might still have bark on your piece of wood. I recommend taking the bark off first because it's just going to fly around and hit you in the face, and you don't want to get hurt. So whenever turning green wood, it is always best to remember to wear face protection. I have prescription eyeglasses, but that's not enough. You want to use a face shield, especially if you have bark on there, because the shavings can come off pretty heavily, and if the bark comes off and hits you in the face, it's going to hurt. Has anybody had that happen before? A couple people? The other reason you want to make sure you have tailstock support and that your piece of wood is secure is because if it comes off the lathe, it's a lot heavier than dry wood. It's going to hurt a lot more. In fact, there was a gentleman a year or two ago down in Louisiana who was hit by a wet piece of wood coming off the lathe, and he's no longer with us. So that's the kind of safety precaution we want to think about when working with something wet or large or heavy in any way. If I were to put something at the full capacity, 16, 18 inches on this lathe, it would probably be 50 or 60 pounds. This is not that much right now, but if you're working with something large on your lathe, it's going to be heavy, and you need to take proper precaution. So, one way, face shield. Second way is that we're going to start to turn this left-handed. Who here is left-handed and who here is not left-handed? Left-handed, Mike. Sorry, Mike's the only one, right? Okay. Do you turn left-handed, Mike? Yeah? I learned how to do this from Mike Mahoney because I was watching a video of Mike Mahoney, and he's standing there with the tool like this, and I was new to turning, and I didn't know right from wrong. So I was like, oh, that's how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to hold it like this and go like that. It wasn't until I saw somebody else turning that I was like, oh, I'm turning the wrong way. Mike Mahoney's left-handed. Did you know that? Yeah. I roughed this out on the bandsaw to get it kind of round. You always want to check to make sure that you're not going to hit your tool rest. There we go. And because it's not fully round, you need to make sure that your tool rest is far enough away that it's not going to hit, but that it's not too far away that you're not going to have good support. You always want to stand out of the line of fire when you start up a piece of green wood. Start it out slow and then bring it up to speed. There we go. So I'm right at 900 RPM and I'm already shaking your lathe here. So we're going to bring it down. You don't need to go fast.
What if you went past that?
Well, if you went past that, this is a small enough piece I can probably do that, okay? So now I'm at 1200 RPM and it kind of evens out. There is still a little shake going on the lathe. It's up to you and kind of your safety. I would recommend if you've never done it before, you bring it up till it starts to shake just a touch and then you bring it back down. Because roughing out at 750 or even 500 is totally fine. I did that on my tiny mini lathe for the longest time with giant pieces of wood on it. It'd take me like an hour to get it like round. And then I could turn the speed up and then I was good. But I'm going to stand left-handed. I'll try not to talk with my face shield down too much. So how many chips hit me coming off the lathe? Most? Zero. They all went that way. They're all over there. So if I was standing here, they would have all hit me right here. And if there was a piece of bark coming off, it would have hit me right here. So that's the advantage of learning how to turn left-handed, and I'm not going to do a full demo on that right now, but if it's something you want to learn, there are people who know how to do it. Mike, it is a safe way to stand out of the line of fire here and get your bowl kind of roughly round. Well, now we can turn our speed up too. So it should be plenty round by now. Yep. So you see how the shavings come right at me when I turn right-handed right there? As long as you've got all your nasty stuff off, you know, which we already do, then you're safe to do that. It's just going to be hitting you right here. That's why it's good to wear a smock or something else to protect you, but you still want to have your face shield on. Now I'm just going to rough this one out real quick. I think we got enough time for that. So I'm not really concerned about my finish on it. All I want to do is remove material quickly and get it down to a usable thickness for me to come back to later on. I think this is the right size. I don't remember. We'll find out. So for your chuck jaws, I want to make a nice dovetail for my chuck, and I want to make sure that I've got my right size there. So I use my calipers here, and just to put a little line in there. It's a little small. You never want to touch both these tips at the same time because it will fly at you. You also don't want to touch the top tip because it will fly over at you. You always use the bottom tine right there, and then you can kind of see that's close enough. Again, I'm roughing this out. I want to leave my tenon a little bit big when I'm roughing out so that when I come back to it in a year and it's shrunk and turned oval, I can still make a round tenon that fits on my chuck jaws properly. Now you can remove a lot of material really quickly when the wood is wet. When it's green, you can see now there's a lot more moisture on here. You can see that's all wet. Once it dries, it'll start to it'll dry. It'll look a little bit less exciting. But because you can take a lot of material off quickly, you need to make sure you're moving your tool rest in every so often, checking to making sure you've got enough room so that you're not just putting it in one spot and then reaching way over your tool rest to try and turn your piece. Who likes to use a scraper to make their tenons? Who likes to use a spindle gouge? Who doesn't make tenons? You can make your tenon any way you want to. With a wet tenon, again, you want to make it slightly oversized because you're eventually going to return it and it's going to shrink. But you want to make sure you have a nicely shaped tenon to fit your jaws, which in this case are dovetail jaws. Who uses a one-way chuck with the, what are they called? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Who uses a one-way chuck? Yeah? If you have the jaws that aren't dovetail, but they have the little like teeth on them right there, you usually want to have a straight tenon, I believe. Yeah? But with a dovetail jaw like on the Vic Mark or on this one right here, you want to have a angled tenon. And I like to have a nice flat right here because this flat portion is where the stability actually comes on your chuck. It's not from the tenon, it's actually from this flat portion being flat up against your chuck jaws right here. So I like to make mine a little bit smaller than my chuck jaw. So it sits on this face, and this is a flat face right here. And then the dovetail can grab down around. What I don't want to do is leave a little hairline right there in the corner, because if my jaw goes all the way into that corner and it gets stuck right there, it's not going to sit flush against this portion right here. A little ruler is really handy to see. You're better to have a slight decline than an incline. So it's slightly, my surface right here is slightly angled down as opposed to angled out, which is what I want it to be. I want it to either be flat or slightly angled in, because that's going to allow this outside of the surface there to sit squarely on my chuck jaw. The other thing you want to keep in mind is if you're drying a twice-turned bowl is you want to make sure that all your edges are slightly rounded, because if they are square or very, if they're very square, that it causes cracking to occur much more readily on that. So I'm going to round this corner out. And that's just going to prevent cracking from occurring there on those edges right there. Okay, now it's just a rough turn bowl, so if I wasn't talking, probably would take me a little bit less time to do. One thing I do want to do that's a little different than some people is I like to have a nice flat bottom right here, or slightly indented, and then I like to have a nice center mark just put in there for the future. What you don't want to leave is leave a little tear out like that, because you'll never be able to get your center point again. Okay, so my outside is done. Now if you look on my sheet there, I think I mentioned for a twice-turn bowl you want to have a thickness of about 10% of your diameter left for your wall thickness. And that's going to count for the warpage that's going to occur, so you can eventually get a nice round bowl out of it. So this is, well, it was like 6 or 7 inches in diameter. So technically I'd want to have well, that's not going to work on that chuck. Forget, there's very narrow jaws on that. One thing I like to do is I like to line up the grain vertically with my tightening point right here, so that I have equal pressure on the different kinds of wood, because with green wood, there's going to be more compression going on right here when you squeeze it. So you want that pressure to be equal all the way around. And you want to check to make sure you've got that flat surface here and that it's registering on the jaws all the way around. You don't need to over tighten it, but with green wood you do want to tighten it. There we go, it should work. All right, now that I've turned it around, I want to turn my speed down just to make sure I'm good. Stand out of my line of fire. There we go. I'm just flattening the surface there, getting rid of the irregularities there. So the bowl this size, I want to have about 3/4 of an inch of material here up at the rim and slightly less down at the bottom. So I'm pretty close there, maybe around an inch, that's fine. When you're roughing out a bowl, it doesn't need to be pretty. I'm taking a lot more time than I usually would. But what does matter is that thickness. You want your thickest point to be here at the top, and then you want to slightly bring it down a little bit so it's going to be less than 3/4 of an inch down here at the bottom. Because you got a tenon down here too, and you got to add that into your thickness. Because if you have a really thick bottom and a really thin top, you're going to get cracking right around here or so. Need to remove a little more material. Yep. It's feeling better. So who's ever turned a rough turn bowl like this? Few people. And again, I want to soften that inside edge so I don't have a sharp edge right here, a sharp angle, because it will be more prone to cracking. Okay, there we go. Want to pass that around? So, it's a little wet, right? I mean, it's not soaking wet, but it's still wet, right? Who knows what you'd want to do to this bowl before you put it on your shelf? Anyone? Would you just put it on your shelf like that, Mike?
Paint the edges.
Paint the edges? Put it in a bag? There's a lot of options you can do.
Date it and wet.
You should definitely date it, and that is the problem with most of my rough outs is I never dated them. And they get really angry when you try to get them back out and see how long you've been with them. But if you don't date your bowls and you don't know how long it's been on your shelf, might have been there a long time for the most part. So they're all pretty old.
Sometimes I'll date and weigh them.
Date and weigh them. That's a great way to do it. And then what you want to do is you want to slow down the drying. You can put it in a paper bag, like I did with this. You can put it in a paper bag with shavings, which would be better to create that microclimate. You could coat it with an end grain sealer. The two primary ones are Anchor Seal, which is a wax emulsion. You're basically painting wax onto the end grain of the bowl.
I just use an old latex paint that I've got left over.
You can use latex paint too. What I tend to use is a PVA sealer.
Elmer's glue.
It's called Tree Saver, but essentially this is Elmer's glue. This has an antifungal agent in it so that it produces less fungus. But it's basically Elmer's glue, and that creates a semi-permeable or not permeable layer on the parts of your tree or your bowl that are going to release liquid quickly, and that's going to be the end grain. So this is a quarter sawn piece, but right here and right here I have side grain. Here and here. There we go. Here and here on the bottom is my end grain. So I'm going to lose moisture from here and here much faster than I am from the sides. So I'm going to paint with my end grain sealer here on the outside and possibly also on the inside of the bowl too. It's kind of up to experimentation. The PVA glue is used by guys in Utah where it's very dry. They cover the whole thing on multiple coats of that stuff. But I've found that depending on the wood here in Kansas, one coat's fine, either on the end grain or just on the outside of the bowl. Sometimes I won't even do the inside. And that's going to go ahead and slow down the drying and prevent those cracks from occurring. It's not 100% accurate, but it's usually pretty good. I used to get probably 10% loss. Now I get less than that. But you got to experiment a little bit with every piece of wood to kind of see how it's going to dry for you. Any questions on the twice turned bowl? I know I kind of zipped through that.
Do you use the shavings that you got off that when you cleaned it, or do you use dry shavings, or?
That's a great question. You want to use the shavings you just took off of it because you want to simulate that same environment that it was just in and then slowly release that, that fluid there, that moisture. And then you could take those shavings out, after a couple of weeks or so, or change them out. No, you don't want to change them out. Just take them out, I would say. And then it's going to be able to dry a little bit more rapidly then too. Yeah, other questions? Okay. Now what I like to do is turn once turned bowls from green wood because they like to deform and they make fun shapes. And if you do it enough, you can start to learn what types of wood are going to do what. Now these pieces are all quarter sawn. They came from the middle of the log. Where's my little log at? Is it out there? That thin slice in the middle. So my log was, I think, about 20 inches in diameter, and they came from these sections right here. So they make really great bowls because they actually have less movement than the bowls that come from over here. It's more predictable. So you get more variety from the bowls you use out here, and then a more predictable shrinkage from those middle sections there.
So
Yeah.
or something, so you pick what would be. I'll catch it.
Okay. If you think about it, let me know. So these pieces actually won't get a whole lot of dramatic change. They will get some, but the quarter sawn tends to be fairly stable. So they're great for platters and things you don't want to move. But you can still turn them green. And they're great for twice turn because you can twice turn a platter and have it nice and flat when you're done. All right, I'm going to try to just move through this pretty quick so we can get you all out of here on time. If anyone has questions, let me know. Again, we're going to start with our speed down. I'm going to stand out of the way. I'll put my tailstock back on. And again, on a screw chuck, do you need a tailstock? With Greenwood, it's highly recommended. Because now I've got this trap between centers. I don't need to crank it in there. This is just going to help trap it, that if something were to happen, I've got a trap between two spots here. Now when you use a big bowl gouge on a little bowl, you have a tendency not to pay attention to where your tool rest is. And I'm about 1.5 inches off my piece of wood here, so I need to make sure I bring that in. So when you're working on a once-turn bowl, you want to leave enough material down here at the bottom that you can get it off and you don't have a hole in the bottom. Don't ask me how I know that. So we're going to put our tenon on here, and then we're going to leave a little bit of a space so we've got some room to work with when we want to part it off. Forgot, I was going to put on some beads or something on here. How many like to decorate their bowls with beads, coves, anything like that at all? Anybody? How many people have never tried it because it looks scary? A couple people. if you want to learn how to roll a bead on a bowl, learn how to roll a bead on a spindle first. And learn the mechanics of how to do it on a spindle. So either with a spindle gouge or a skew or whatever tool you might want to use. Learn how to do it on a spindle and then try to do it on a bowl. All right? So if we want to put on a bead somewhere, I don't think I'm very proficient at rolling beads, but it's all about kind of this body movement, and you need to twist your tool in and then twist it back out and bring it back up, and there's this whole motion that's occurring as you're making the beads. There's a guy named, if you guys are on YouTube, a guy named Scott Alexander, Alexander Designs, who did a video on rolling beads on a bowl, and he rolls all sorts of beads. He's the bead master. I'd recommend you take a look at that to really kind of learn how to roll a bead. There's other sorts of tools you can use to roll a bead if you want to, such as this D-Way beading tool right here. I don't know if you can see that up there. There are a lot of beading tools like it. The only problem with this is that you can only get a bead this size. And when you're turning a bowl and you've got side grain and end grain coming at you, what happens is that when you use this tool, you're going to, at some point, run into end grain fibers right at the top or the apex of the bead, and it's going to tear out. So you can't actually go all the way in with this tool right here. You can use it on a bowl, but you want to be careful that you don't go all the way in because you will tear out the end grain and just rip up the bead. So you're better to learn how to do it with a bowl gouge or a spindle gouge to get a nice bead on the bowl itself.
What was his name again?
Scott Alexander.
Alexander. Okay.
Yep. You can find him on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook probably. But yeah, he's a really great guy. He's been sharing a lot of knowledge. And he makes large beads, small beads, any beads you want to make. And he does it all day long. You'll see when making a bead with a gouge, you really have to bring the tool all the way around and get all the way into that groove right there. If you don't get all the way into that groove right there, you're not going all the way in, and that's where you're going to get caught and you're going to get a catch. But when you bring your tool in right there, it's unlikely you're going to get a catch as long as you're right there in the middle because there's really nowhere for it to go. Now I say that, and I'm going to get a catch probably on the next time I do it, right? There you go, I wasn't paying attention with my wing. And I caught the bead. So this is a terrible wood to demonstrate on because it has some nice figure in it and it makes it really hard to get a clean cut. Or it's the perfect wood to demonstrate on because it shows how much tear out you can get with a good cut and a bad cut. So I'm going to try to do a little push cut around here. I'm having a little bit of trouble here because of the tailstock right there. But with a nice clean cut, you know, with these wet fibers, it can make a nice clean surface there. But sometimes it won't. And sometimes it'll tear out one way, but not the other way. Now, you know you're supposed to go downhill when you're cutting, which in this case on a bowl is like this. But sometimes if you cut backwards, it actually works better. You have to go nice and slow. Now this one is better than this one over here. I can see some tear out right here. But if it was really tearing out one way or the other way, you can always try to go backwards and see if it's going to work for you.
Would you explain your forwards and backwards for those of us who are just getting started?
Absolutely, yeah. So when I'm talking about forwards and backwards or uphill and downhill, the rule of thumb is you always want to be cutting downhill. So if we have a piece of,
You mean like wider to narrower?
we're actually talking about the wood fibers. So we got a spindle here, right? Yep. We're talking about a spindle. To cut downhill, you're going to cut around and down into the middle. Okay? So that's how you can make a bead shape like this, is because you're cutting from the top down. From the top down. With a bowl, the wood is turned this direction. So to go from the top down, you actually have to go around the outside of the bowl this way. Okay? So if I'm going this way, I'm technically going backwards, I'm going uphill. Because these fibers this way are unsupported by the fibers behind it, and they can tear. Whereas if I'm going this way, there's a fiber behind it that's holding it up straight, and I can slice through it. It's kind of like if you're shaving. You can shave one way real nice, but not the other way. It's the same thing with this. Is that one way will usually have a nice clean cut, and the other way won't. So generally, you want to be cutting from the bottom of the bowl to the top on the outside of a bowl.
And that's where you're using the push cut, as you were saying?
Correct. And what I mean by that is I want to get a bevel rubbing cut. So this is a specialty gouge. The only thing I use it for is doing a push cut. And it has kind of a short bevel right here. And I ride that bevel all the way around with the tool. Okay? And that's going to be my push cut. If I'm using this gouge right here, which has the same angle as this tool right here, but it has these large wings on it, I can do what's called a pull cut or a scraping cut, where I can pull the tool this way, but my bevel's way over here. I'm not using that at all. I can also do a bevel rubbing cut with this tool the same way, like this. The reason why I like to do a bevel rubbing cut with this tool is because I have a nice kind of wide flute right here. It's a very nice progressive curve versus a very sharp curve on this swept back tool right here. Okay? So it's a little more forgiving with that tool. But you've got to use the tool enough to get it short enough that you don't have anything else to do with it, and then you can make one of those. So let's get the tailstock out of the way, because the best way to do this is from all the way over here. So now I've got my bevel rubbing or floating. And I'm making these nice kind of wispy shavings right here. And I have a nice clean surface, even on the end grain, which is where it's going to tear out. I have a nice clean surface. You know, you can see some of the lines right here maybe. You know, I hit that with a tiny bit of sandpaper, it's going to go right away. So I'm perfectly fine with this curve right here. It feels nice and smooth. And those lines I'm not going to worry about at all. I do want to fix this bead real quick and then get it hollowed out and try to get it kind of thin for you. That's probably a more appropriate size bead for this bowl anyway. Another thing to note is you always want to be putting pressure towards the headstock whenever you can. I really don't want to be cutting this way because I'm cutting away from the headstock where I'm supported. I generally always want to be cutting towards the headstock whenever I can. Probably saying, wait a minute, you didn't finish the top yet. How many of you have a spindle that is perfectly centered and perfectly in round? Because if you do, I want to see your lathe. But chances are when you put this around, because it's damp and wet, when you turn this around into chuck, it's going to compress, and those fibers are going to compress, and your bowl is going to become out of round. Which, depending on how thin you want to turn it, is a big deal or not a big deal at all. Now, if you can slip a little piece of paper in between the base of your tenon there and your chuck, you've got too much space. It's amazing, but just that little bit of space will cause this whole thing just to flutter and give you a whole lot of trouble. I'm just switching to sharper tools that are the same as the other ones I was using before. But you can see, maybe you can't, just by turning this around, it's just slightly out of round. Which if I'm going to do a really thin wall, it'll mean that one side of the wall might be 1/8 of an inch, the other might be a 1/16, the other might be a 1/16, the other might be a hole, you know, depending on how thin you want to go. Usually if I'm going to do something really thin, I'm going to turn it around in the chuck as early as I can, reshape it from right here, and then hollow it out. I'm just going to try to hollow this out real quick, and then talk about just how I finish this off real fast. There we go. Okay, so we're at about a 1/4 of an inch or so right here. Don't ever put your fingers inside a moving bowl. That's your other safety tip for the night. That's pretty good. Want to be careful not to hit the outside rim when it's this thin, otherwise it'll just crack, because that's what I did at the Kansas City demo a couple months ago, is I hit the outside rim with my gouge and cracked it. So I'm switching to a bevel angle that's about 55 degrees versus about 35, 40 degrees, so that I don't have to bring my tool as far around here into my sidewall to get to the bottom. Now, I've done enough of these that I can just use my fingers to tell about where I'm at and how much room I have there. You should always use a set of calipers if that's easier. It's usually great to start that way. Now I want to get you guys out of here on time, so we're pretty close there. We're going to call that good. No, the bottom's not good. All my cuts on the inside here have pretty much all been bevel roughing cuts, so I don't need to pull a scraper out. I don't need to smooth anything out. I kind of don't even want to do any sanding on it. But I am just going to use an abrasive buffing pad. It's a non-woven pad. And this is just going to help cut down some of the fibers here and polish it up a little bit. And then I would put it in my paper bag. Well, I'd weigh it first. I'd write the weight on the outside of my bag, put it in there, weigh it every couple of days, and probably in about 2 or 3 weeks, it'll be fully dry, and I can go ahead and finish it off. I'll usually buff the outside with one of these pads. I'll just put it in my drill on an arbor and kind of buff the outside. I'd usually do a little bit of sanding on it first and then end with this, and this will be kind of my final finish right there.
You know it's ready when it quits losing weight.
You know it's ready when it quits losing weight. That's right. There we go. We know it's dry, or it's reached the EMC, the equilibrium moisture content, when it stopped losing weight and it's been steady at the same weight for a couple of days or a week. Yeah. All right. What other questions you guys have about Turner green wood? I know I did kind of the science thing in the beginning and then just kind of churned a little bit. So if you have any questions.
Did you say you put a photo finish on it right now, or?
I will not. That's not my deal. Some other people do that. I would leave it dry like it is, just in the bag there, so it can dry naturally. Yeah. And I'll take this off and pass it around. And you can see, you know, this side right here is perfectly round, but then you can see that it's not quite totally round there because there's just a little bit of change there when you squeeze the jaws around it, and it just moves just a little bit to get it out around there.
That pad, what kind of pad is that used?
This is made by Mirka. I forget what they call it. What if you look up non-woven sanding pad? Scotch-Brite makes them, 3M makes them. 3M makes a white pad, which has no abrasive in it, and I really like that for buffing. This has about 1,500 grit fibers in there. So it does sand a little bit, and they've got ones that are like 360, 600, 1,500. I just use the 1,500 as a buffing pad. You can even use a cotton buffing wheel if you have like a Beal system or something like that. Although with something like this that's really thin, the Beal system is going to tear it apart. So I would recommend not doing that. Yeah. Great. Any other questions?
Okay, let's get in the hand in there.